refused to sign over the acres, walked away with just $1. My kids panicked. The inheritance. For as long as Margaret could remember, the ranch had always been a part of her life. Nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, the land was as much a part of her as her own breath. It was where she and her late husband Victor had built their lives together, tending to the land with their own hands, dreaming of a future that would carry on for generations. But now, standing in the doorway of her farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret could feel that dream slipping through her fingers. Her children, all grown now, had begun to pressure her. They were grown-ups with lives of their own, jobs, families, and aspirations. But their voices, once full of love and respect, had begun to take on a more insistent tone. They wanted to sell the ranch, the family home, where they had been born and raised, where Margaret had cooked meals and bandaged scraped knees, would no longer be theirs. They told her it was time to let go. It wasn't just the house, they explained. It was the land, too. There was no money to be made from farming anymore, they argued. It wasn't like the old days when their father had built this place from the ground up. At first, Margaret resisted. The thought of selling felt wrong, like betraying everything Victor had worked for. He had loved this land with a fierce passion. Even in the final days of his life, when his body was frail and tired from years of labor, he had never once given up on the ranch. Margaret remembered the way he'd smile as he stood at the edge of the pasture, looking out over the fields, his eyes shining with pride. "This is our legacy, Margie," he'd said. "We've built something that'll last. Something that will live on long after we're gone." Now, as she stood alone, staring out at the sprawling fields, Margaret couldn't help but wonder what Victor would have thought about all this. It was no longer just a matter of family disagreements. It was about preserving a life that had been carefully nurtured over the years. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was her history, her memories. Every fence post, every field of crops, every stone in the house's foundation held echoes of her life with Victor. Letting go of it felt like erasing part of her soul. But her children didn't understand. They had their own families, their own ambitions. The ranch didn't hold the same significance for them. It was just a burden they couldn't afford to carry any longer. They saw it as an opportunity to cash out, to sell the land to developers who would turn it into something new, something that might make them rich. They could move on with their lives, they said. They'd helped out enough, done their part. Margaret had made a promise to Victor years ago, a promise to always hold on to the ranch, to keep it in the family. But now that promise was being tested. It wasn't just about the land. It was about her children's future. Margaret had always wanted the best for them, but now she was beginning to wonder if they saw the ranch as something to be passed down or as something to be discarded. She loved them, of course, but the way they spoke about the ranch, as if it were a mere object to be traded, hurt her deeply. She remembered when they were children, running through the pastures, their laughter ringing out like music, the sun shining down on their faces as they played. It was hard for her to reconcile those memories with the cold, businesslike way they were talking about the property now. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, the old oak table that had been with the family for decades, and put her hands in her lap. She thought back to when she and Victor first bought the land, when they had nothing but hope and a willingness to work hard. They had both come from humble beginnings, but together, they had managed to build a life they could be proud of. They had poured their hearts into the ranch, shaping it with their own sweat and tears. Their children had grown up there, running barefoot through the fields, helping out on the farm, learning the values of hard work and perseverance. But now, those same children were ready to turn their backs on the land that had nurtured them. "I can't do this, Victor," she whispered to the empty room, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't just let it go. It's all we have left of you. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the table, feeling the years of use embedded in its surface. It had seen so much: weddings, birthdays, tears, laughter. It was a symbol of everything they had built together. And now, in her heart, Margaret knew that if she sold the ranch, she would lose more than just the land. She would lose the last connection to the love she had shared with Victor. But what else could she do? She was getting older, and the physical toll of managing the ranch alone was becoming harder to bear. The fields needed tending, the barns needed repairs, and every season brought new challenges. She had been managing the place alone for so long now, and it was taking a toll on her body. She had to admit it. She couldn't keep it up forever. Maybe, just maybe, selling was the practical thing to do. Yet, even as she thought it, Margaret knew in her heart that practicality wasn't the only thing that mattered. The ranch was more than just a piece of land. It was a part of her history. It was where she had built a life with Victor, where they had shared their dreams, their hopes, and their struggles. She couldn't let that go, not without a fight. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the land that had been her world for so long. The wind stirred the tall grass, and for a moment she thought she could almost hear Victor's voice, soft and reassuring, as if he were standing beside her. "This land is our legacy, Margie," he would have said. "Don't let anyone take it from you." And in that moment, Margaret knew what she had to do. She would fight for this ranch, for Victor's memory, and for the future of her family. She couldn't let it slip away without a fight. But how could she make her children understand? How could she make them see that the land wasn't just something to be sold, but something worth preserving? Memories of Victor. The house felt quieter than it ever had before. The once lively conversations, the laughter that echoed through the halls, and the sounds of footsteps across the floor seemed to have faded with the years. It wasn't just that the children had grown and moved away. It was as though the house itself had taken on a different energy, one that Margaret couldn't quite explain. But it was in these quiet moments that she found herself missing Victor the most. She could still remember the first time they walked through the front door of the farmhouse. It had been an old, worn-down building back then, nothing like the sturdy home they had eventually built together. But Victor had been so excited, so full of vision. He saw potential in every corner, in every cracked wall, in every worn floorboard. He had looked at the land with the same eyes, filled with hope and determination. "It's perfect, Margie," he had said, his arm draped around her shoulder as they stood together in the doorway. "It's exactly what we've been looking for." Margaret had been nervous at first. The ranch was a big commitment, a huge responsibility, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. But Victor had a way of making everything seem possible, of turning every challenge into an opportunity. She couldn't help but follow his lead, trusting him completely, as she always had. Over the years they worked side by side, planting crops, fixing fences, and building a life they were both proud of. The long hours were exhausting, but they always found joy in the work they did together. Whether it was tending to the animals or fixing up the house, it felt like every project was a small victory. They were partners in every sense of the word, and Margaret had always loved that feeling, that sense of unity, of working toward a shared dream. Victor had an incredible work ethic. He was never afraid to get his hands dirty, always willing to do whatever it took to make sure the ranch ran smoothly. It was the way he approached life, never shying away from hard work, never asking for anything he didn't earn. He had taught Margaret that the ranch wasn't just about making a living. It was about pride, about building something that would last. When their children were young, they had been so eager to help. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were days when they were frustrated, when the work seemed endless. But Victor always found a way to make it fun, to make it feel like a family effort. He would tell them stories about the old days, about pioneers who had come before them and built their own farms from the ground up. "We're just continuing their legacy," he'd say, his voice filled with pride. "This land was made to be worked, and we're the ones to carry it forward." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she sat in the old rocking chair by the fireplace, the chair where she and Victor had spent so many quiet nights together, talking about the future. Those were the moments that she cherished the most. The quiet moments when it was just the two of them, and the world outside seemed to fall away, but now, those moments were gone. It had been 5 years since Victor passed, and while the pain had dulled with time, it had never truly left her. She still expected him to walk through the door at any moment, to hear his deep voice calling her name. She still looked for him in the fields, in the barn, and sometimes she could almost feel him beside her, as if he were watching over the land. The house felt so much emptier without him. Even when the children were around, there was a part of her that felt a deep, unshakable loneliness. It wasn't just the loss of Victor, it was the loss of the life they had built together. She didn't know how to move forward without him. How could she? He had been her partner, her best friend, her everything. Margaret reached for the old photograph album that had been passed down through generations. The pages were yellowed and frayed, but the memories inside were as vivid as ever. She turned to the page with the picture of her and Victor on their wedding day. They were young, full of hope, and standing in front of the same farmhouse that they had turned into a home. Margaret smiled through her tears, remembering how beautiful that day had been. Victor had been so handsome, so confident, and the way he had looked at her made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. "You always were my dream," she whispered softly to the photo. As she flipped through the pages, she found another photograph, one of their children. Her heart swelled with love and a little sadness as she remembered them growing up on the ranch. It had been such a joy to watch them all learn, grow, and eventually leave to build lives of their own. But that joy was now bittersweet. They had all grown up, and the ranch that had once been the center of their world was now just a place that seemed to hold memories of a time that was slipping away. She thought about her conversation with her children earlier that week. They had been so insistent, so sure that selling the land was the best thing for everyone. And perhaps it was. They weren't children anymore. They had their own lives to live, and the ranch couldn't provide for all of them in the way it once had. But there was something inside Margaret that couldn't bear the thought of it all being torn down. She knew it wasn't just about the house or the land, it was about preserving the legacy that she and Victor had worked so hard to build. She sat in the quiet room, the crackling of the fire filling the space around her, and wondered what Victor would say if he were here. Would he have agreed with the children? Would he have seen it as a way to move on, to let go? Or would he have fought for the ranch, as she intended to? The truth was, Margaret didn't know. But she did know one thing. The decision wasn't just about the money or the practicality of it all. It was about honor. It was about the promise she had made to Victor to protect the land that had been the heart of their life together. She couldn't let that promise go. And so, as the fire burned low, Margaret made a quiet vow to herself. She would not let go without a fight. She would hold on to this land for as long as she could, for Victor, for their children, and for the legacy they had built together, no matter what it took. Pressure mounts. The following week brought more phone calls, more visits, more papers laid out across the kitchen table like silent accusations. Margaret tried to hold her composure as she poured coffee into her chipped porcelain mugs, the same ones she'd used for decades. But her hands trembled slightly as her daughter Sandra spoke again, her tone growing more clipped with every sentence. "Mom, we're not trying to upset you. Sandra said, brushing her highlighted hair behind her ear. "But this place? It's too much. You shouldn't have to deal with all of this on your own. The fencing alone could cost thousands, and don't even get me started on the roof." Margaret nodded slowly, stirring cream into her own cup. She didn't argue, not yet. She knew the words before they came. Her son Michael, sitting across the table, took over. "We've talked to a developer, Ma," he said gently, as though his voice could soften the blow. "They're offering a fair price. Enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You could even move to town, closer to the grandkids." Margaret's eyes didn't lift from her coffee. "You make it sound like I'm already gone," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "Like the rest of my life will happen somewhere else, not here." "Mom, that's not what we mean," Sandra cut in, suddenly impatient. "We're just trying to make sure you're safe, taken care of. You're 73. It's not fair for you to handle all this." There was that word again. Fair. It rolled off their tongues so easily, like an excuse neatly wrapped in concern. But Margaret could feel something else beneath it, an urgency that went beyond their love for her. She reached across the table and touched the edge of one of the papers Michael had left. The crisp white page was covered in numbers and legal jargon she didn't fully understand. But one thing stood out. Purchase agreement. "I remember when you two learned to ride," Margaret said suddenly, eyes still fixed on the paper. "Sandra, you were 5, terrified of the pony, but Victor walked beside you until you stopped shaking. Michael, you fell off and got the wind knocked out of you. Your father made you get right back on. Said, if you love something, you have to earn it." Michael shifted uncomfortably. Sandra's jaw tightened. "I did love this place, Ma," Michael replied. "But I've got a mortgage and 2 kids. I can't run this ranch, and neither can you. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just don't see the point of holding on to something that's falling apart." Margaret finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp, clear, and unflinching. "It's not falling apart," she said. "It's aging, like me." There was a long silence. Even the ticking wall clock seemed louder than it should have been. "We know it means something to you," Sandra said, her tone softening. "But what about us? We're your children. Don't we matter too?" That question hit deeper than it should have. Margaret looked at the 2 people sitting at her table, not just her children anymore, but grown adults with burdens she had once shielded them from. In their eyes, she could still see the children she had raised, but now they were clouded by practicality, by fear, by financial stress. Of course they mattered. They mattered more than anything. But the land mattered too. It was her heart, her history, her promise to Victor. How could she choose between that and them? Later that evening, after they had left and the house had gone quiet again, Margaret stood out on the porch, watching the breeze move through the tall grass like an invisible river. She thought about what Sandra had said, about fairness, about letting go. Maybe they were right in some ways. Maybe she was holding on too tightly, but as she looked out over the fields, glowing gold under the fading sunlight, she didn't see a crumbling ranch. She saw a life, a legacy. Every tree planted with care, every post hole Victor had dug by hand, the barn they had rebuilt after the fire in '89, the swing under the old oak tree where her children used to laugh until their bellies ached. How could they not see it? The next morning, she found an envelope slipped under her door. It was from Michael. Inside was a handwritten letter, a kind one, thoughtful. He apologized for pushing too hard, said he understood that the ranch meant more than just land. But then at the end, he gently repeated the offer, said he and Sandra were willing to help handle the sale if she changed her mind. Margaret held the letter for a long time. She could feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just her children. Neighbors had sold their properties too. The nearby road had already widened in preparation for a housing development. Little by little, the land around them was changing. She felt like the last holdout in a world moving too fast. She was tired. That was the truth. Some days her knees ached just getting out of bed. The thought of dealing with livestock, fencing, taxes, it overwhelmed her more than she wanted to admit. And yet, whenever she considered signing those papers, something inside her recoiled. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a sense of duty, of purpose, of something unfinished. Margaret walked into Victor's old study, where nothing had been touched since he passed. His books were still on the shelves, his worn jacket still hanging on the back of the chair. She sat down at his desk and ran her fingers over the leather blotter, now cracked with age. There, in the corner drawer, she kept a small photo of them from the early days. They were standing in front of the barn, arms around each other, covered in dust and sweat, but smiling. It was that kind of love that had built this place. "They don't see it the way we did," she whispered, holding the photo close to her chest. "But maybe I can help them understand." Margaret didn't know how yet. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to be pressured into giving up what mattered most, not without finding a way to honor what she and Victor had started. The ranch still had a heartbeat. And for now, so did she. The emotional connection. Margaret woke up the next morning with the same sense of unease that had crept into her life since the conversation with her children. The house was quiet. Too quiet for a house that had been full of laughter, voices, and the familiar hum of everyday life. Her thoughts circled back to the ranch, to Victor, and to the legacy they had worked so hard to create. She had spent her whole life here. The ranch wasn't just a piece of property, it was a part of who she was. Every inch of the land had a memory attached to it. A memory of their first harvest together. The time they had built the barn with nothing but their hands. The quiet moments in the evening when they would sit on the porch, side by side, and listen to the wind rustle through the trees. Those moments had defined her life, and letting go of them felt impossible. How could she simply walk away from something that held every meaningful experience of her marriage, every moment of joy, hardship, and love? The thought of selling the ranch, of handing it over to developers who would rip it apart, felt like a betrayal, not just to Victor, but to herself. It wasn't about the house, or the fields, or the money. It was about the heart of it all, the connection she had to the land and to Victor. How could she explain that to her children? How could they understand that the land wasn't just a property? It was her history, her love, and her loss. She walked outside, taking in the familiar scent of earth and grass. The air felt thick with the weight of her thoughts, and as she gazed out over the fields, she was transported back to a time when things were simpler, when the world was full of possibilities and the future seemed bright. She remembered the first time Victor had taken her to see the ranch. They had been young then, full of hope and excitement. The land had been nothing more than a dusty field, but to Victor, it had been full of promise. He had looked at her with those eyes, so full of vision, so full of belief, and said, "We can make something beautiful here, Margie. We can make it ours." And they had. Over the years, they had poured their hearts into the ranch. Every fence they built, every crop they planted, every piece of wood they sawed and hammered together, was a testament to their hard work and their love. The ranch wasn't just a home. It was their life's work, their legacy. As she stood there, the wind brushing through her hair, Margaret couldn't help but think of the many nights she and Victor had spent out here, just the two of them. There had been no distractions, no worries. They had simply been together, breathing in the fresh air, listening to the quiet hum of the world around them. Victor had always been the dreamer, the one who saw potential in everything, but it was Margaret who had kept the dreams grounded in reality. Together, they had made it work. Together, they had created a life that was beautiful, meaningful, and real. But now, that dream seemed to be slipping away, fading with the years. The ranch was no longer the thriving, bustling farm it once was. Farming had become harder, the costs of maintaining the land were rising, and the younger generation wasn't as invested in the ranch as they had been. Margaret's children were ready to move on, to let go of the land and the legacy it held. They didn't see it the way she did. They saw a burden, a piece of property that could be sold for profit, a way to move on to bigger and better things. Margaret's heart ached as she thought of them. She loved them, of course, but it seemed like they had forgotten what the ranch had meant to their father, and to her. They had grown up here, learned the value of hard work and perseverance, but somewhere along the way, it had all been lost. The ranch was no longer a symbol of their family's legacy. It had become a burden they were eager to be rid of. How could they not see that this was more than just land? It was the very essence of who they were. It was where they had learned to work together, to support each other, and to appreciate the simple joys of life. It was where they had grown up. As she walked further into the fields, Margaret felt her connection to the land deepening. The earth beneath her feet was solid, unyielding, and yet it felt like an extension of herself. She knelt down and ran her fingers through the soil, feeling the warmth of the earth against her skin. It was as though the land itself was speaking to her, urging her to remember the dreams she and Victor had shared, the promises they had made to each other, and the legacy they had built together. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to be enveloped by the quiet beauty of the ranch. It was in the soft rustle of the leaves in the trees, in the distant sound of the cattle lowing in the barn, in the scent of the wildflowers that grew along the edges of the fields. It was in the memories, in the love, in the sweat and tears that had gone into making this place what it was. Margaret knew that selling the ranch wasn't just about parting with property. It was about losing a piece of herself, a piece of the life she and Victor had built together. It was about letting go of the past, of the love they had shared, of the dreams they had dreamed. And she wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Maybe never? She stood up slowly, her body aching from the years of hard work, but her resolve strengthening. She couldn't let go of the ranch. She couldn't let her children erase the legacy that Victor and she had created. She would fight for it, for him, for the life they had built together. But how? How could she make them understand that this wasn't just about money or practicality? How could she make them see that the ranch was more than just a piece of land? It was her heart, her soul, and her love for Victor. Margaret didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't give up, not without a fight. The secret meeting. It was a cloudy Thursday afternoon when Margaret began to feel a strange tightness in her chest, not from physical strain, but from something more emotional, something she couldn't quite name yet. The quiet around the house had become unnerving. There had been too many hushed conversations lately. Too many moments when Sandra and Michael exchanged glances they thought she wouldn't catch. Too many texts abruptly ended when she entered the room. She had chalked it up to stress at first. The family was under pressure. She was under pressure. But something didn't sit right. Later that day, she found the clue she hadn't been looking for. Margaret had gone into the study, Victor's old space, searching for a notepad. She still used the desk, though she never moved much on it, leaving Victor's things largely untouched. It brought her comfort, having a piece of him there. But as she opened the bottom drawer to grab a pen, her fingers brushed against a sleek leather folder, one she hadn't put there. Curious, she pulled it out, not expecting much, maybe old tax papers or notes Victor had forgotten to file. Instead, she found neatly printed documents. Legal papers, her name, her property, her signature, blank. Margaret's breath caught. It was a contract, more precisely, a transfer of property rights. From her, the legal owner of the 1,200 acres, to a development firm based 2 counties over. The date on the document was from 2 weeks ago, and beneath that were notes. Handwritten notes, in Sandra's handwriting. Her heart began to race. There were bullet points about options to move Mom to assisted living, maximize value before year end, and, most painfully, she's emotionally attached, be strategic. Margaret dropped the folder as if it had burned her fingers. Her stomach turned. It wasn't just the idea of the sale. It was the realization that they had been planning it without her, behind her back, as if she weren't capable of making decisions anymore, as if she were just a sentimental old woman too fragile to hold on to her own life. She sank into Victor's old chair, the weight of betrayal heavy in her chest. These were her children, her babies, the same hands that had once clung to her skirt when they were scared, the same voices that had called her mama in the middle of the night. How could they do this? She stared at the papers, as though by sheer will she could make them mean something else. But they were clear. Her children had met with a lawyer. They were strategizing around her, planning to remove her from the very place she had devoted her life to. She felt like a stranger in her own home. That evening, when Sandra and Michael returned to the house to check on her, Margaret was waiting for them in the living room, the folder open on the coffee table like a silent accusation. The room went quiet as they walked in. Margaret didn't speak. She only looked at them, her eyes firm but hollow. Sandra was the first to react. "Mom, I can explain—" "No," Margaret cut her off, her voice low and steady. "You can answer." Michael shifted his weight awkwardly, glancing at his sister. "We didn't mean for you to find those yet." "Yet?" Margaret repeated, her voice sharp. "So you did mean for me to find them eventually? When exactly? Before or after the ink was dry?" Sandra stepped forward, trying to sound calm. "Mom, we were just trying to get things in order in case you needed help. You've said yourself how tired you are. This ranch is too much for one person. We were trying to plan ahead." "By planning around me?" Margaret snapped. "By deciding what's best for me without even asking me?" There was a long silence. "We didn't want to upset you," Sandra said finally. "We were going to bring it up when the time was right." Margaret stood slowly. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't let it show. "Let me make something very clear. I may be old, I may be tired, but I am not invisible, and I am not incompetent." "We didn't mean to treat you like that," Michael said quietly. "We just thought this would be easier. That if we handled the details first, we could present it to you with all the facts and a clear solution." "A solution to what?" Margaret asked. "To the problem of my existence?" "No, Mom," Sandra said quickly. "To the stress, the financial pressure, the upkeep. We were trying to take care of you." "But not once did you ask what I wanted," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "You forgot that I'm not just someone to manage. I'm your mother. I built this home with your father. Every beam, every fence post, every acre of soil, we poured our lives into it. And you were a part of that. You were." Sandra looked like she wanted to cry. Michael couldn't meet her eyes. "I found a letter from your father," Margaret added after a moment. "He wrote that if I ever had to let the ranch go, I should do it only when I was ready. Not because someone told me to, and certainly not because I was being pushed out. "I'm sorry, Mom," Sandra said, her voice soft. "We handled this badly." "Yes, you did," Margaret replied, "but it's not too late to make it right." The air in the room shifted, a crack in the wall of betrayal. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something different. Margaret didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the ranch would stay in the family forever. But at that moment, one thing was certain. Her voice would be heard. Her story would not be erased. And her children would never again make plans about her life without her sitting at the table. The secret meeting had been exposed. And now, it was time for the real conversations to begin. The secret meeting. Margaret had never liked secrets. Secrets felt like shadows, lurking just out of sight, ready to pounce when least expected. And yet, there she was, sitting in her old rocking chair, the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down on her chest. Her children had kept something from her, something that, in her heart, she had always feared. It wasn't just about the money, or the land, or the offer from the developer. It wasn't even about their pressure to sell. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. Her children, her own flesh and blood, had begun to meet with a lawyer behind her back to set the wheels in motion for transferring the ranch to new owners. The realization hit Margaret like a freight train. She had suspected for a while now that they were moving toward this decision, but to learn that they were already taking steps behind her back made her feel as though the ground beneath her was slipping away. They had been her children, her legacy. How could they have hidden this from her? How could they make such a monumental decision without even involving her in the process? She had spent so many years raising them, teaching them the value of hard work, of love, of family. She had taught them that the land was a part of them, that it was a gift, a legacy they would one day inherit. How had that lesson been lost on them? The day she found out was a rainy Thursday afternoon. Margaret had gone to town for groceries, a simple errand that had become an ordinary part of her routine. When she returned home, she noticed something odd, an unfamiliar envelope tucked under the front door. She had been expecting bills, maybe a letter from an old friend, but not this. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was addressed to her, but there was no return address, no signature. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, she found a letter that made her blood run cold. It was from the lawyer her children had hired. The letter outlined the steps they had taken to prepare for the sale of the ranch, the terms of the agreement, and even the price they were negotiating with the developer. The words felt like a betrayal, a wound that had been cut too deep to heal. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she read the words. "We have reviewed all of the options for your property, and we believe this is the best course of action to ensure a profitable future for the family." Her eyes blurred as she reread the letter. How could they have done this without telling her? How could they have made such a monumental decision without even having a conversation with her? Margaret sat down heavily on the couch, the weight of the letter pressing on her chest. She felt sick, angry, and betrayed all at once. She had known that they wanted to sell the ranch. But this? This felt like they were erasing her from the equation entirely. The thought of her children, the people she had raised, who had learned to walk and talk on this very land, making plans to sell it without her input, tore at her. They had been so insistent, so certain, that selling was the right decision. But Margaret had never imagined they would go so far as to make it official, to hire a lawyer and take matters into their own hands. She could feel the tears stinging at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to break. She had been strong for so many years, and this would be no different. Margaret stood up and walked to the kitchen, her mind racing. She needed to confront them, to ask them why. She needed answers, not just for herself, but for the legacy they were about to throw away. She didn't know how to make them understand, how to show them that this wasn't just about land or money. It was about family, history, and love. As she picked up the phone to call Sandra, Margaret's mind was already racing ahead to the conversation that would follow. She knew that Sandra would be the first to answer. Michael always took longer to respond, distracted by his work. When Sandra's voice came through the line, Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Mom! Hey!" Sandra said. Her voice was calm, too calm, and it made Margaret's stomach churn. "How's everything?" "Everything's fine, except for the fact that I just found out about your little secret meeting," Margaret said, her voice steady, but firm. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Margaret could almost hear Sandra's breath catch. "Mom, I'm not going to let you do this," Margaret cut in, her voice sharper now. "I saw the letter. I know what you've been planning." "Mom, it's not like that," Sandra said quickly. "We've been talking to a lawyer, but it's not a done deal. We were just trying to figure out the best way to move forward. We wanted to make sure we had all the facts before we talked to you." Margaret could feel the anger rising in her chest, and it took everything she had not to yell. "You didn't think to talk to me first? You didn't think that I might have something to say about selling the ranch?" "Mom, we just thought—" Sandra's voice faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "We thought this was the best thing for everyone. It's been so much work for you, and you don't need this kind of stress at your age. We just want what's best for you." Margaret clenched her fist, feeling the weight of Sandra's words like a slap to the face. "You think selling the ranch is what's best for me?" she asked, her voice low and trembling. "This place, this land, it's all I have left of Victor. It's everything." Sandra was silent for a moment, and Margaret could hear the faint sound of her sighing on the other end. "I understand, Mom. I really do. But you have to understand that we're just trying to make sure you're taken care of. We're doing this because we love you." Margaret's heart broke as she heard the words. Sandra was right. They did love her. But they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. Not the way Margaret did. "I'm not ready to let go of this land," Margaret said, her voice firm once again. "And I'm not going to let you sell it without a fight." Seeking help. The days after the conversation with Sandra felt like they blurred together. Margaret moved through her routine like she was walking through a fog, her heart heavy, her mind racing. The decision to sell the ranch, or not to sell it, seemed like an impossible choice, one that threatened to tear apart everything she had built with Victor. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest, suffocating her. It wasn't just about land. It was about memory, legacy, and love. After that conversation, Margaret knew she needed help. She could no longer fight this battle alone. The ranch was more than just a piece of property. It was the embodiment of a life shared with Victor. She needed someone who understood that, someone who could guide her through the legal maze and give her the strength to stand up to her children without feeling like she was losing them. There was only one person Margaret trusted enough to turn to: Eloise, her oldest and dearest friend. They had known each other since childhood, their lives intertwined by years of shared experiences, laughter, and the quiet understanding that comes from a deep friendship. Eloise had been there for her when Victor died, when the world seemed to crumble beneath her feet. She had been the one to bring over soup and listen when Margaret had felt completely alone in her grief. Eloise, now in her late 70s, was a sharp woman with a mind that had only grown more astute with age. She had spent her career as a lawyer, and even in retirement, she had kept her wits about her. Margaret knew that if anyone could help her navigate the murky waters of family and legal disputes, it was Eloise. That afternoon, Margaret called Eloise and asked if they could meet. "I need your advice, old friend," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can you come by? I'm dealing with something difficult." The line was quiet for a moment before Eloise responded. "Of course, Margaret. I'll be over in an hour." When Eloise arrived, she was carrying a large tote bag filled with papers. As always, she looked sharp, her silver hair neatly pulled back, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She gave Margaret a warm hug before sitting down at the kitchen table, her eyes immediately assessing the tension in Margaret's posture. "You've been through a lot lately, haven't you?" Eloise said softly, her voice comforting but direct. "Let's talk about it." Margaret nodded, exhaling deeply. She felt the floodgates open as soon as she started speaking. She told Eloise about the letter from the lawyer, about her children's insistence that she sell the ranch, and about the deep sense of betrayal she felt. She explained how she had tried to make them understand that this was more than just land. It was a part of who they were, a piece of their history, their legacy. Eloise listened intently, her face expressionless, but her eyes filled with understanding. When Margaret had finished, Eloise placed a hand on her shoulder. "Margaret," she said, her voice steady, "I know this land means everything to you. I can see it in your eyes. But you have to understand that your children may not see it the same way. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to solve a problem in a way that makes sense to them." Margaret shook her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. But how could they not see it? How could they not understand that this is our history? It's not just a place, Eloise. It's our life. Eloise nodded, her eyes soft with compassion. "I know. And I understand how deeply this hurts. But sometimes people don't see things the way we do. Sometimes they're caught up in their own lives, their own struggles, and they forget what things like this mean to the generations that came before them." Margaret sniffled, wiping her eyes. "I just don't know what to do anymore. I can't let them sell it. But if I fight them, I'll lose them. I'll lose them for good." Eloise gave her a reassuring smile, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "You won't lose them, Margaret. Not if you handle this with care. You may not be able to change how they feel about the ranch, but you can make sure they understand why it's so important to you. It's going to take patience, understanding, and maybe a little bit of legal guidance." Margaret nodded slowly, the weight on her shoulders lifting just a little. "But I don't know how to do that." "That's where I come in," Eloise said with a wink. "I'm here to help you every step of the way. We'll sit down together, look over everything, and figure out a way to approach this. But I want you to remember something. No matter what happens, you have a right to fight for what matters to you. Your feelings are valid." Margaret felt a small flicker of hope. "Do you really think I can stop them? That I can make them understand?" Eloise's eyes were filled with conviction. "You can. But you also have to be prepared for the fact that they may never fully understand. And that's okay. What matters is that you stand your ground, you make your voice heard, and you show them the depth of your connection to this place. If they can't understand that, well, then at least you'll know that you did everything you could." Margaret sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of Eloise's words sink in. She had always known that this battle would be difficult. She had always known that her children would struggle to see things from her perspective. But hearing Eloise's words made her realize that it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about making sure that her voice was heard, that she stood firm in her beliefs, and that she fought for what she knew in her heart was right. "Thank you, Eloise," Margaret said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Eloise smiled warmly. "That's what friends are for, Margaret. Now let's take a look at that lawyer's letter. I'm sure we can come up with a strategy. You're not alone in this." As they began to go over the papers, Margaret felt a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. And with Eloise by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could make her children understand what the ranch truly meant. A desperate decision. The days that followed were filled with tension. Margaret had called her children to let them know that she wouldn't sell the ranch. They had argued, of course. They had pleaded, explained that they just wanted what was best for her. They didn't understand why she couldn't see the practical side of things, the money, the comfort, the security that would come from selling the land. But Margaret knew in her heart that none of that mattered. She couldn't let go of this piece of her soul, this piece of her history. She couldn't let go of Victor. But as much as she resisted, there was a nagging feeling deep inside that kept growing stronger. The feeling that maybe her children were right. Maybe this was the only choice left. The ranch was falling apart, and she couldn't keep up with the repairs anymore. The cost of maintaining the property was overwhelming, and every day that passed felt like one more day she was slipping further behind. Her body ached more and more, her joints creaking with the wear and tear of years of hard work. The days of running the ranch alone were wearing her thin, and the thought of having to continue doing it for the rest of her life was almost unbearable. Margaret sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the wind was soft against her face. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her again. She had told her children no. She had stood her ground. But the truth was, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. What if she couldn't afford to maintain the ranch? What if the repairs became too costly? What if she couldn't handle it on her own anymore? The silence of the evening seemed to close in around her. The ranch, once full of life and energy, now felt like a ghost of what it had been. The barn, which had once echoed with the sound of animals and workers, was now eerily quiet. The fields, once bursting with crops, now lay dormant, the earth too tired to yield anything. Margaret could almost hear Victor's voice in the wind, urging her to keep going, to never give up. But the truth was, she didn't know if she could anymore. The decision weighed on her like a heavy stone in her chest. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to push through adversity. But now, as she sat alone on the porch, the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could feel the tears threatening to fall, but she didn't let them. She wouldn't cry. Not yet. But then, as if a light bulb went off in her mind, an idea struck her. What if she did sell? What if she did what her children had been asking her to do all along? Maybe it wasn't the worst thing. Maybe, just maybe, selling the ranch would give her the peace she so desperately needed. Maybe it would give her the opportunity to live out the rest of her life without the weight of the land on her shoulders. Maybe it was time to let go. She stood up, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Her back ached, and her legs felt like they were made of stone, but she forced herself to move. She walked slowly toward the kitchen, her mind racing with the possibilities. There was a part of her that was terrified of what selling the ranch would mean, what it would say about her, about everything she had worked for. But there was another part that wondered if it might be the right choice. Margaret pulled out the letter from the lawyer again. She had read it 100 times, but now it felt different. The words that had once seemed like an attack now seemed like a lifeline. The promise of a fresh start, the chance to be free of the constant pressure to maintain the ranch. It was tempting. She thought about the things she could do with the money, the places she could visit, the way her life could be different. For the first time, the idea of letting go didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a relief. But then she thought of Victor. She thought of the love they had shared, of the promises they had made. She thought of the way they had dreamed together, of the future they had planned for this place. She thought of their children, and how they had grown up on this land, how they had been taught to appreciate the value of hard work, of dedication. How could she turn her back on all of that? How could she walk away from the life they had built together? Margaret sank into a chair at the kitchen table, her mind in turmoil. She had spent so many years working alongside Victor to make the ranch a success. It was all they had ever dreamed of. And now, here she was, standing at the crossroads of a decision that would change everything. Could she really sell the land? Could she really walk away from everything they had worked for? Her fingers traced the edges of the letter, and for a moment, she thought about picking up the phone and calling Sandra and Michael, telling them she was ready to sell. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to accept that the world had changed, that the ranch was no longer the place it once was. But as soon as the thought entered her mind, another thought quickly followed. Victor wouldn't want this. He would want me to fight for it. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to push the uncertainty out of her mind. She could feel the pressure of the decision, the weight of it bearing down on her. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know which choice was the right one. As the evening stretched on and the sky darkened, Margaret sat in the quiet of her home, unsure of where to turn next. Her mind was full of questions, full of doubts, but one thing was clear. She couldn't make this decision alone. She needed guidance. She needed to find a way to reconcile the love she had for the land with the reality of her life now. The decision wasn't just about money. It was about preserving a piece of her past, honoring the life she had built with Victor. But could she continue to fight for that past, even when the future seemed uncertain? Could she keep holding on, even when every part of her body was telling her to let go? Victor's letter. The wind had begun to pick up outside, whistling through the trees as Margaret sat alone in her living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm her as the chill of indecision settled deep inside her. She was still holding the letter from the lawyer, her fingers pressing against the paper, as though the weight of it might somehow reveal the answers she so desperately sought. Margaret had spent hours thinking, weighing her options, replaying the conversations with her children, wondering if she had made a mistake by holding on to this ranch for so long. Each thought brought more confusion, more doubt. She loved the land, of course, but was it enough to justify the mounting struggle? Was it worth losing everything for? Was the land really worth fighting for? Or had she become a prisoner of nostalgia, holding on to something that no longer served her? Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the small shelf that held the few remaining items that connected her to Victor, his worn leather gloves, his favorite hat, and a few photographs of the two of them on their wedding day. There, tucked between the pages of an old family Bible, was the letter. Victor's letter. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it. She hadn't seen it in years, hadn't dared to read it since the day Victor had written it. It had been left to her after his passing, tucked away in an envelope with the words, "For Margie," written in Victor's familiar handwriting. She had kept it safe, but never opened it, until now. Unfolding the paper slowly, Margaret could feel the weight of the past filling the room. She knew what it was, Victor's words to her, his final thoughts on the ranch, on their legacy, and on their shared life. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready to revisit the emotions it would stir. But with a deep breath, she began to read. "Margie," it began, the familiar warmth of his voice jumping off the page. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer around to say these words to you in person, and I know that breaks your heart as much as it breaks mine. But I need you to hear me now, even if I'm not there." The words made Margaret's chest tighten. She could almost hear Victor's voice in her mind as she read, as though he were still sitting beside her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash over her. "I know we've built something beautiful here, something that took time, effort, and love. We've poured our souls into this ranch, and I wouldn't change a thing. But I also know that life changes. The world changes. And I want you to know that no matter what happens, this land isn't just a farm. It's a place where we lived, where we loved, where we raised our children. It will always hold a part of us." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she read Victor's words. He had always been the optimistic one, the dreamer who believed in the power of their work and the future of the ranch. But even he understood the inevitability of change. "If the day ever comes that you have to let go, don't do it because you think it's what I would want. Do it because you've found peace with it. Don't carry the weight of this ranch as a burden. Carry it in your heart, and remember what we built together. But if you can keep it, if you can hold on to it, do it for the future, for the memories we've made and the ones still to come." Margaret paused, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. She had never read these words before. They had always felt too final, too difficult to face. But now, in this moment of uncertainty, they felt like a lifeline, a guiding star to help her navigate the storm of emotions she was caught in. "Margie," the letter continued, "if you need to sell the ranch, I'll understand. I know we're both getting older, and I know the years of hard work can take their toll. But please, don't do it because it's easier. Don't do it because someone else tells you it's time. Do it when you're ready, when you know in your heart it's the right thing to do. And don't be afraid to ask for help. You're stronger than you think, but it's okay to lean on others when the weight is too much." Margaret's hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming love that filled her heart. She could feel Victor beside her, in his own way, reminding her that she didn't have to carry this burden alone. The thought of asking for help, of letting go, had always been difficult for Margaret. She had prided herself on her independence, on the strength she had built over the years. But maybe, just maybe, Victor was right. It was okay to ask for help. It was okay to lean on those who cared about her. Finally, Victor's letter said, "I want you to remember this. You are my partner, Margie. You've been my partner in everything, from the first seed we planted to the last fence we built. This ranch may be our legacy, but you are my greatest achievement. Whatever you decide, I know you'll make the right choice. I love you." Margaret folded the letter slowly, her chest tight with emotion. She had always known that Victor had loved her, but these words, these final words, felt like a balm to her aching heart. They reminded her of the strength they had shared, the dreams they had built together, and the love that had never wavered. But now, as the reality of her situation set in, Margaret realized that she had to make her own decision. Victor had given her the freedom to choose, and in a way, he had given her permission to let go if she needed to. It wasn't about abandoning the ranch. It was about making peace with whatever decision she made. Margaret stood up from her chair, her hands still shaking as she held the letter close to her chest. She felt lighter, somehow. The weight of the decision didn't feel as heavy as it had before. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, and she knew that the future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she had clarity. She didn't have to make this decision alone, and she didn't have to hold on to the ranch just for the sake of the past. Victor had trusted her to make the right choice, and now it was time for her to trust herself. The battle begins. The weeks that followed Margaret's reading of Victor's letter passed slowly, as if the weight of it hung over her like an unspoken promise. She had decided, with a sense of quiet resolve, that she would not let go of the ranch without a fight. It wasn't just the land, and it wasn't just about her. It was about the legacy she and Victor had built together, the love that had shaped their lives, and the generations that had walked across this earth. The ranch was a living, breathing part of their history, and she couldn't allow that to slip away into the hands of strangers. Her children, however, were not going to make this easy. Sandra and Michael, with their well-meaning concerns and practical arguments, continued to pressure her. Every time they visited, they pushed her to see the situation from their perspective. Selling the land wasn't just a good idea. It was the only option, the only sensible choice. But Margaret wasn't sure that sensible was enough anymore. She had always believed in doing the right thing, but now she was beginning to question what the right thing really was. It wasn't about the money or the comforts that came with selling. It was about protecting what they had created, what had once been their family's dream. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that, by selling, she would be erasing the very essence of who they were. One morning, when Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of her, she made up her mind. She would fight for the ranch, no matter what. She wasn't going to let her children or anyone else take it from her without a clear, determined battle. But how? The answer came to her when she picked up the phone and called Eloise. If anyone could help her navigate this complex legal situation, it was her old friend. Eloise was sharp, wise, and had spent years working as a lawyer, even in her retirement. She knew how to handle family matters like this with grace and strength, and Margaret needed that kind of expertise now more than ever. Eloise arrived at Margaret's house early the next morning, bringing with her a sense of calm and certainty. Margaret had always admired Eloise for the way she approached problems, never rushing, always taking her time to think things through. As soon as Eloise stepped through the door, Margaret felt the weight in her chest ease a little. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't carrying this burden alone. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Margaret explained everything. How her children had been pressing her to sell, how they had already gone so far as to hire a lawyer, how she felt torn between her love for the ranch and her desire to keep the peace with her children. Eloise listened patiently, her eyes thoughtful as she absorbed the details. "Margaret, I understand how you feel," Eloise said after a long pause. "This isn't just a legal battle, it's an emotional one. And I can see why it's so hard for you to let go of something that's been such a part of your life. But you need to know that, legally, you have the right to fight for what's yours. No one can take it from you unless you let them." Margaret nodded, but she felt a tremor of doubt. "But how can I fight them, Eloise? They're my children. They don't see what I see. They don't understand the importance of the ranch." "I know," Eloise said gently. "That's why you need to approach this with compassion, but also with strength. You don't have to tear your relationship with them apart, but you do need to make it clear that this isn't just about the land. It's about the life you've built here, and the memories that live within these walls." Margaret sat up straighter, feeling the resolve begin to stir within her. "I don't know if I can make them understand, but I can't just give up. I can't just sell it because they say it's the right thing to do." "No, you don't have to," Eloise agreed. "But you need to be clear about your intentions. If you truly want to keep the ranch, then you have to be prepared to stand firm. You have the legal right to refuse to sell. If they're going to force the issue, They'll have to go through legal channels. But let's be clear. You don't want it to go that far unless you absolutely have to. Margaret leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table. What do I need to do to make sure I'm ready for this? Eloise took a deep breath and pulled out a folder from her bag. First, we'll go through everything. The papers, the deed to the property, anything that's been signed, any legal contracts or agreements. We'll make sure everything is in order. Then we'll look at your options, whether that's trying to mediate with your children, going to court, or a combination of both. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. She hadn't realized how much she needed Eloise's guidance until that moment. It was as if the path forward had suddenly become a little clearer. She didn't know how long the fight would last, or how much it would cost emotionally and financially, but she knew that she couldn't give up without trying. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Eloise worked together to build a strategy. They reviewed the documents, talked to real estate agents, and even met with a mediator to see if they could reach a compromise with Sandra and Michael. Eloise helped Margaret stay grounded, reminding her to focus on what truly mattered and not to get swept up in the emotions of the battle. But as much as Margaret wanted to find a peaceful resolution, it became increasingly clear that her children weren't interested in compromise. They were resolute in their desire to sell the ranch and move on. The tension between them grew with every conversation, each one leaving Margaret feeling more disconnected from the family she had worked so hard to raise. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Sandra, Margaret found herself standing alone in the barn, staring at the tools and machinery Victor had used for so many years. The smell of hay and dust filled the air, and for a brief moment, she felt as if Victor were standing beside her, his presence as real as ever. It was as though he was whispering to her, urging her to stay strong. Margaret took a deep breath and wiped away the tears that had started to form. She was tired, exhausted even, but she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. The battle was just beginning, but Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for the ranch anymore. She was fighting for the legacy of her family, for Victor's memory, and for a future where her children could see the value of what had been built, not just in terms of money, but in terms of love, history, and the life they had shared. A twist of fate. As the days stretched into weeks, the tension between Margaret and her children began to feel almost unbearable. Each interaction with Sandra and Michael seemed to bring her closer to a breaking point. The arguments had escalated, and it was clear that neither side was willing to give in. Margaret's heart ached as she thought about how far things had fallen between them. The ranch, once the center of their lives, had now become the wedge between mother and children, a symbol of everything they couldn't agree on. Despite her resolve to stand firm, Margaret couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation closing in on her. The legal proceedings were slow, drawn out by back-and-forth negotiations, and the occasional letter from the lawyer. Margaret tried to stay hopeful, but each passing day felt like a battle. She was fighting not just for the ranch, but for her family, for a piece of the life she and Victor had worked so hard to build. And yet, in the middle of all the turmoil, something unexpected happened. A twist of fate that neither Margaret nor her children could have foreseen. It was one rainy afternoon when the call came. Margaret had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the papers laid out before her, trying to make sense of the next steps. The constant flow of legal jargon and technicalities had begun to blur together, and she felt the pressure of the fight mounting once more. She could hear the rain tapping against the windows, a rhythmic sound that almost seemed to match the beating of her anxious heart. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Margaret reached for it, her hand trembling slightly. It was an unknown number, and for a moment she hesitated. She had become so used to hearing from her lawyer or her children that any new number felt like an intrusion. But something told her to pick up the phone. "Hello?" she said, her voice tentative. "Margaret, it's John Matthews," the voice on the other end said. Margaret blinked, momentarily caught off guard. John Matthews. The name was familiar, but it took her a moment to place him. He had been one of the original landowners in the area, a neighbor of Victor's before he had passed away years ago. Margaret had always respected John, and the two families had gotten along well. He had been a fixture in the community for decades, a man with a reputation for fairness and integrity. "John, it's good to hear from you," Margaret replied, her curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" "I'm calling about the ranch," John said, his tone serious. "I've been keeping an eye on the situation with your family, and I need to speak with you. It's important." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't help but feel a wave of apprehension wash over her. What could John possibly want? Was this another attempt to buy the ranch? Another offer she wasn't ready to hear? "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's something you need to know," John continued, his voice tight. "I've just found out that the developer your children are negotiating with has a history of not being entirely upfront about their intentions. They've made offers to other landowners in the area, but I've heard rumors that they've been using questionable tactics to push those sales through." Margaret's mind whirled. She felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. The developer. The very same one that had made the offer to buy her ranch. What was John saying? That they had been using underhanded methods? "I'm not saying they've done anything illegal," John added, his voice lowering. "But I've seen enough in my time to know that something doesn't feel right. I wanted to let you know before you make any more decisions." Margaret's hands were shaking now. She had spent weeks agonizing over the decision to sell, wondering if she was doing the right thing, wondering if she could ever reconcile with her children. And now, this news from John, this twist of fate, was changing everything. "Why are you telling me this now, John?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always respected Victor, and I know how much the ranch meant to him," John replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't stand by and watch you be taken advantage of. Not by these people. If you want to keep the ranch, I'll help. I can give you the resources, the legal support you need. But you have to make the decision, Margaret." Margaret was stunned into silence. John was offering to help her, offering to fight for the ranch alongside her. She had known him as a neighbor, a kind man with a good heart, but she had never imagined he would come to her aid like this. It was a lifeline she hadn't expected. "John, I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "This means everything to me." "You don't have to say anything right now," John replied. "Just think it over. But don't let those developers fool you into thinking selling is the only way. You've got options, Margaret, and I'll stand by you no matter what you decide." The conversation ended soon after, but Margaret's mind was racing. This unexpected turn of events had given her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. She had never expected help from outside the family, but now, with John's support, she saw a path forward. One where she could fight for the ranch without feeling like she was fighting alone. As the rain continued to fall outside, Margaret sat back in her chair, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She thought of Sandra and Michael, her children, who she loved dearly, even though they didn't understand. She thought of the battle ahead, the legal battles, the potential rift between them. But with John's help, she now felt like there was a chance. There was a way to fight back. She wasn't ready to give up yet. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was her heart, her history, and the memory of Victor. And with John's unexpected support, Margaret was ready to stand her ground. She would fight for it. She would fight for Victor, for her family, and for the legacy that had been built on this land. As the evening wore on and the rain finally subsided, Margaret took a deep breath. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. And with the unexpected help of an old friend, she knew she had a fighting chance. Emotional reflection. The weeks that followed John's phone call passed in a blur of activity. Margaret found herself juggling the pressure of legal proceedings with the mounting emotional toll of watching her family slowly drift away from her. The situation had become a delicate balancing act, fighting for what she believed in while trying not to alienate her children completely. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she wanted to give in, to sell the ranch and end the turmoil, but each time she stood on the precipice of making that decision, something inside her held her back. The memories of Victor, of the love they had shared and the life they had built, wouldn't allow her to let go so easily. Every evening, she sat on the porch, the familiar creaking of the rocking chair filling the silence, and she thought about all the years she and Victor had spent on this land. There were days when it felt like the weight of their history was pressing down on her, suffocating her with its intensity. Other times, it felt like a blessing, a gentle reminder of what they had shared and the bond they had created. She could almost hear Victor's voice in the wind, his quiet strength urging her to keep going, to hold on to what they had fought for. She thought back to the early days when she and Victor had first arrived at the ranch, young and full of dreams. It had been a modest beginning. The farmhouse was old and weathered, the land a blank canvas waiting for them to shape it. But Victor had seen potential where others saw only hard work. His optimism had been infectious, and for the first few years, it had been enough to carry them through the hardships. They had worked day and night, side by side, building something together that they could be proud of. Those years had been filled with laughter and love, and though the work was exhausting, it had never felt like a burden. Even when things got tough, when the crops didn't grow as they had hoped or the livestock fell ill, Victor always found a way to push through. He had a way of making everything seem like it would turn out okay in the end. It was one of the things Margaret had loved most about him, his ability to see the light, even when things seemed darkest. As the years went on, their family grew. The ranch became not just a home, but a place of learning, where their children grew up with a sense of responsibility and pride in the work they did. They learned to feed the animals, to repair fences, to plant crops, and to appreciate the value of hard work. Margaret had always believed in teaching her children the importance of self-sufficiency, of knowing how to take care of themselves and others. She had wanted them to understand that the ranch wasn't just a business, it was a legacy, something that would endure long after they were gone. But as the years passed and the children grew older, their connection to the land began to fade. Margaret had watched, heartbroken, as Sandra and Michael moved away to pursue their own lives, their own dreams. They visited less frequently, and when they did come home, they seemed more distant, more focused on their own concerns than on the ranch. Margaret tried to hold on to the hope that one day they would return, that they would understand what the land meant to her and to Victor. But the longer she held on to that hope, the more she realized it was slipping away. The letters from the lawyer, the talks with Eloise, the conversations with her children, it all started to blend together in a haze of stress and anxiety. There were moments when Margaret felt as though she was losing everything: her home, her children, her sense of self. The legal fight to keep the ranch felt like an uphill battle, and every conversation with Sandra and Michael seemed to deepen the divide between them. They were so certain that selling the ranch was the right choice. They saw it as a practical solution to an impractical problem, a way to relieve the burden of maintaining a piece of land that no longer held the same meaning for them. But Margaret couldn't see it that way. This was more than just land. It was everything. It was Victor's laughter in the evenings as they sat together by the fire, their hands intertwined. It was the late-night conversations they had about the future, about their dreams of leaving something lasting behind. It was the countless hours spent working together, side by side, building a life that was theirs. How could she explain that to her children? How could she make them understand that the ranch was more than just property? It was their family's soul. She closed her eyes one evening as the sun began to set, the orange glow casting long shadows across the fields. She could see Victor there, just as he had been all those years ago, standing at the edge of the pasture, looking out over the land. She could hear his voice in her mind, calm and steady, reminding her of all the reasons they had fought for this place. "You've always been strong, Margie," he would say. "You're the heart of this ranch. Don't let go of it now." Margaret wiped the tears that had slipped down her cheeks. She could feel his presence so clearly, as if he were standing right next to her. She wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't just walk away from the life they had built together. But she also knew that she couldn't keep fighting alone. The battle was taking its toll on her, both physically and emotionally. She had to make a choice, one that wasn't just about what was best for her, but what was best for her family. She couldn't do it on her own anymore. Margaret stood up and walked back toward the house, her mind filled with conflicting thoughts. She couldn't give up on the ranch, not yet. But she couldn't keep fighting without help. She had to find a way to bridge the gap between her children and herself, to make them understand what she had spent so many years trying to teach them, that family, history, and love meant more than money or practicality. It was time to have one final conversation, a conversation that would either bring them together or push them further apart. But Margaret knew that she couldn't leave things as they were. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She had to speak her truth, no matter the cost. A change of heart. The days seemed to stretch endlessly as Margaret wrestled with the emotions that had been building up for so long. Her heart ached with the weight of everything, the ranch, the land, the memories of Victor, and most painfully, her growing sense of distance from her children. She knew that she couldn't carry the burden alone any longer, but what was the right way forward? Every decision she made seemed to drive a deeper wedge between her and the people she loved most. Yet despite the overwhelming sense of isolation, Margaret refused to give up on her family. One evening, just as Margaret was preparing to settle in for the night, the phone rang. She almost didn't answer it, thinking it might be another call about the legal proceedings or yet another email from her lawyer. But something told her that this call was different, so she picked it up. "Hello?" she said, her voice steady, but tinged with the exhaustion that had become a constant companion. "Mom?" The voice on the other end was Sandra's. Margaret froze for a moment, surprised by the call. It had been days since their last conversation, and their previous exchanges had been anything but easy. "Sandra, is everything okay?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the tension out of her voice. I think we need to talk," Sandra said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Can I come by tomorrow? I need to explain some things." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The moment when her daughter would either take another step away from her or finally begin to understand. Her instincts told her to tread carefully. Whatever Sandra had to say could change everything, again. "Of course," Margaret replied, trying to keep the conversation as calm as possible. "I'll be here." The next morning, Margaret went about her usual routine, but it felt different today. There was a strange, almost unbearable anticipation hanging in the air. She cleaned, cooked, and made the coffee, but all the while, her thoughts kept circling back to Sandra's call. What had changed? Why was Sandra finally willing to talk? When the doorbell rang at midday, Margaret's pulse quickened. She opened the door to find Sandra standing there, her eyes red and swollen as though she had been crying. It startled Margaret for a moment. Sandra, always so strong and composed, wasn't the type to wear her emotions on her sleeve. "Mom," Sandra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry." Margaret stepped back, gesturing for her daughter to come in. "Come inside," she said softly. "Let's talk." The two of them sat down at the kitchen table, the familiar surroundings offering a strange sense of comfort. Margaret studied her daughter, noticing the lines on her face, the way her shoulders were hunched like she was carrying a weight she could no longer bear. For a long time, Sandra was silent, and Margaret let her take the time she needed. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Finally, Sandra spoke. "I don't even know where to begin, Mom," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been so caught up in what I thought was best for you, for the family, that I didn't even stop to think about what you needed. I didn't listen, and I'm sorry for that." Margaret's heart began to soften as she listened. This wasn't the Sandra she had known for so long, the daughter who had always been so focused on practicality and logic. This was the woman she had raised, a daughter finally coming to terms with the emotional depth of the situation. "I've been so focused on the ranch being a burden," Sandra continued. "I didn't see what it meant to you, what it meant to Dad. And I was wrong. I thought if we sold it, it would be easier for everyone, but now I see how much it's a part of who we are. It's not just a piece of land, it's home, it's memories, it's love." Margaret swallowed hard, her eyes welling up with tears. This was the conversation she had hoped for, the conversation she had feared she would never have. Her daughter, finally acknowledging the importance of the ranch, finally understanding that the land wasn't just property, it was family. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Sandra said again, her voice breaking. "I don't know if we can keep the ranch. There are so many things to figure out, but I want to try. I want to be here for you. I don't want to lose this family over a piece of land." Margaret felt a rush of emotion. She had never imagined that Sandra would be the one to come to this realization. But here she was, opening her heart in a way that Margaret hadn't expected. Her daughter was willing to meet her halfway. She wasn't asking for everything to be perfect, but she was offering something that felt even more important: understanding. Margaret reached across the table, taking Sandra's hand in hers. "I don't know what the future holds, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I do know this. You and your brother mean more to me than anything. I never wanted to fight with you. I just wanted you to understand why this ranch matters so much to me. It's not just about the past. It's about our future, our memories, and the legacy we've built together." Sandra nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "I understand that now, Mom. I truly do. And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Margaret's heart swelled with love and relief. This was the turning point she had been waiting for, the moment when the divide between them had begun to close. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It was about family. It was about healing the wounds that had formed over time and realizing that sometimes the most important thing wasn't being right, it was being together. Sandra took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. "Let's talk to Michael. We can figure out a way to keep the ranch and the family together." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Yes, let's do that." For the first time in months, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over yet, but with Sandra's change of heart, there was a chance, an opportunity to move forward as a family, to find a way to preserve what they had all shared. The road ahead would still be difficult, and there would be obstacles to overcome. But Margaret knew that together they could face whatever came next. And as she looked at Sandra, she realized that, despite everything, the most important thing had always been love. And love, she believed, would carry them through. The resolution, the days following Sandra's heart-to-heart with Margaret felt like a quiet, yet transformative turning point. As much as Margaret had longed for a resolution, a clear path forward, it had been elusive. Yet in Sandra's admission, her apology, and her desire to make things right, Margaret found the spark of hope she had been missing. The ranch, the land that had been the source of so much conflict, was beginning to feel like something that could be saved. Not just preserved as a place, but healed as a family legacy. The very next day, Margaret arranged to meet with Michael. She had been uncertain about how he would respond. After all, he had been the most vocal about selling the ranch. But she knew, deep down, that they had to face this together. The rift between her and her children had stretched far too long, and if she was going to keep the ranch, she would need them both. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about understanding, rebuilding, and learning to communicate in a way that would bring them back together. As Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for Michael to arrive, her mind raced. The emotional weight she had been carrying seemed a little lighter now, but the future still hung in the balance. She had to speak her truth, just as she had with Sandra. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. The door opened, and in walked Michael, his usual confidence tempered by the tired look in his eyes. The last few months had clearly taken a toll on him as well, and Margaret couldn't help but feel the tug of empathy for her son. He wasn't just her child. He was a man, struggling with decisions that were beyond his control. Decisions that, in his mind, had already been made. "Mom," Michael said softly, his voice lacking the usual bravado. "I'm sorry I've been so difficult." Margaret smiled at him, a small, heartfelt smile, one that spoke volumes. "You don't have to apologize, Michael. But we do need to talk. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I think we've all been caught up in this more than we should be. We need to figure this out together." Michael sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table as though he wasn't sure how to approach the conversation. "I know, and I want to understand. I think I've been so focused on what makes sense logically that I've missed what's important." Margaret nodded. "I get that. But the thing is, Michael, this ranch isn't just about logic. It's about family. It's about history. And it's about love. The love that Victor and I put into this place. The love I have for all of you." Michael's gaze softened. "I know that, Mom. I do. It's just, I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm stuck between wanting to make sure you're okay and also doing what I think is the right thing for the future." "And what do you think is the right thing?" Margaret asked, gently, wanting to hear his perspective, wanting to understand where he was coming from. "I guess I thought selling the ranch would make everything easier," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I'm starting to see that it's not just about making things easier. It's about preserving what we have, even if it's hard. I didn't get that until now." Margaret felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. "Michael, selling the ranch doesn't make things easier. It just makes them different. It doesn't make the memories go away. It doesn't erase the love we've shared here. And that's what I've been trying to hold on to all along." Michael nodded, his eyes searching Margaret's face, as though trying to gauge whether she was being entirely honest with him. "I didn't realize how much this place meant to you, Mom. I was so focused on what seemed practical that I forgot to think about what it really meant. I forgot to see the bigger picture. And I'm sorry for that." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm yet comforting. "I know you were trying to do what you thought was best. But this land, this ranch, it's not just about property. It's about what we've built as a family, what Victor and I built. It's about our legacy. I can't just let that go without a fight. And I don't want to fight you. I want us to find a way to make this work. Together." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was filled with the weight of what they had both been carrying. Michael, with his concerns for the future, Margaret with the burden of keeping the past alive. But in that silence, there was a shift. Margaret could feel it. A softening, a willingness to understand on both sides. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "So what now? How do we move forward?" Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. "I think the first step is talking to each other, like we're doing now. We need to be honest with one another, and we need to keep this family together. I don't know what the future holds for the ranch, but I know I can't do this without you and Sandra." Michael nodded. "I want to make this right, Mom. I don't want to lose what we have. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." Margaret squeezed his hand. "That's all I need to hear, Michael. Together, we'll figure it out. One step at a time." Later that afternoon, Margaret, Michael, and Sandra sat down together in the living room, the air heavy with anticipation. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension between them, no unspoken animosity. They were ready to talk. Truly talk, about the ranch, about their future, and about the family that had once been whole and could be again. Margaret looked at her children, the people she had fought so hard to protect. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I do know this. We are stronger when we work together. And no matter what happens, we'll always be a family. And that's something no one can take away from us." Sandra reached over and placed her hand on Margaret's, her eyes filled with tears. "We'll figure this out, Mom. Together." Michael nodded, his voice soft. "We will. I promise." In that moment, Margaret felt the heavy weight of the past few months begin to lift. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but it no longer felt like a battle she had to face alone. With her children by her side, she knew that no matter the outcome, they would rebuild, not just the ranch, but the family bond that had always been at the heart of it all. The road ahead would still be challenging. But as Margaret sat there, with Sandra and Michael beside her, she finally felt a sense of peace. They had faced the storm, and now they were ready to face whatever came next. Together. The legacy lives on. The weeks after their decision to come together were the most transformative of Margaret's life. The ranch, the land that had once been the source of so much tension and heartache, was now beginning to feel like a symbol of something else: hope, reconciliation, and the possibility of rebuilding what had been fractured. Margaret's decision to fight for the ranch had never been just about the land. It had been about the family she had worked so hard to build and the memories she had cherished for decades. And now, with Sandra and Michael by her side, she saw the possibility of healing. Margaret knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The legal battles were far from over, and there were still questions about what the future would hold for the ranch. But something had changed within her children. Their perspective had shifted. They no longer saw the ranch as a burden to be offloaded. They saw it as a part of their shared legacy, something worth fighting for. One quiet morning, several months after their difficult discussions, Margaret found herself standing on the same porch where she and Victor had spent so many evenings. The house seemed a little quieter now, but there was a sense of peace in the air. The wind whispered through the trees, and as she looked out at the land stretching before her, she could almost feel Victor standing there beside her. Victor had always been the dreamer, the one who believed in the potential of the ranch. He had seen it as more than just a piece of land. It was a living, breathing entity, a place where their dreams had taken root. Margaret had never fully understood that until now. The ranch had never just been about survival or profit. It had been about something far more significant. It had been about creating a place where love and memories could grow, just as the crops and trees did. It was a place where time moved slowly, where every season brought new challenges, but also new possibilities. She had spent years thinking of the ranch as a symbol of hard work, and in many ways, it had been. But it was also a place of joy, of laughter, of connection. It was a place where they had created something that would live on long after they were gone. And now, as she stood there, Margaret realized that the legacy they had built together was not something that could be measured in dollars or land deeds. It was measured in the lives they had touched, in the way they had nurtured and cared for each other, and in the way they had taught their children the values of love, respect, and family. Margaret smiled softly to herself. She could almost hear Victor's voice in her ear, his steady, reassuring tone that had always made her feel like anything was possible. "You've done more than build a farm, Margie. You've built a home. And that's what lasts." She felt that truth in her bones now. What had started as a place of hard work had transformed into a home, a symbol of their shared life and a testament to the strength of their family. And even though it had been a difficult road, Margaret knew that their family's bond was stronger than ever. Sandra and Michael had come to understand, in their own way, what the ranch meant to her and to them. They had come to realize that the ranch wasn't just about keeping the past alive. It was about building a future. Together. It was a Saturday afternoon when Margaret sat down with her children to discuss the next steps. Sandra and Michael had been on the ranch more in the last few months than they had in years, and Margaret could see the change in them. They were no longer just helping her. They were actively taking ownership of the place, contributing their ideas, their labor, and their time. They were finally beginning to understand that this was not just an inheritance, but a responsibility. "I think we're ready to move forward," Margaret said, her voice steady, her heart full. "We're not going to sell the ranch, and I'm glad you both see why this is so important to me. But we also need to make sure it's sustainable, financially and practically." Michael nodded. "We've been talking, Mom, and I think we have some ideas that can help make it work. I know it's a big undertaking, but I'm ready to be involved. I want to make sure this place stays in the family." Sandra, too, smiled. "We're not just doing this for you, Mom. We're doing it for all of us. This ranch is a part of our history, and we want to be a part of its future." Margaret looked at her children, her heart swelling with pride. They had come so far. From the days of arguing and misunderstandings to this moment, where they were finally united in their vision for the ranch, Margaret knew that everything they had gone through had been worth it. "I'm so proud of you both," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I've spent so much time holding on to this place, but now I know that it's not just mine to hold on to. It belongs to all of us. And together, we'll make sure it continues to thrive for generations to come." With those words, they all knew that their journey was far from over, but it was a journey they would face together. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but Margaret no longer feared the future. She felt confident in the strength of their family and the love they had for each other. They were no longer bound by the past. They were united by a shared vision for the future. Over the next few months, they worked together to make necessary repairs, revisit old plans, and modernize parts of the ranch that had long been neglected. There were difficult decisions to be made, but with every challenge, they grew closer, their bond stronger than ever. And as the seasons changed, So did their outlook on the future. The ranch, once a symbol of struggle, now stood as a beacon of hope and renewal. One sunny afternoon, as Margaret stood once again on the porch, looking out over the land, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought for the ranch, for her family, for the memories that held so much meaning. And now, as she watched her children working together in the fields, laughing and sharing the work, she knew that the legacy of the ranch would live on, just as Victor had wanted. This was their future. Together. And it was brighter than Margaret had ever imagined. Margaret's journey to protect the ranch was never just about land or property. It was about family, love, and legacy. Through the emotional turmoil and difficult decisions, she came to understand that the ranch was more than just a piece of Victor's and her life. It was the heartbeat of their family's story. The struggles with her children had created a divide, but through open, honest communication and a willingness to listen, they found their way back to each other. The turning point came when Sandra and Michael finally understood the deep emotional connection Margaret had to the land. They recognized that preserving the ranch wasn't just about keeping it. It was about honoring the memories of their father and the life they had shared. With Margaret's steadfastness and the support of her children, they decided to work together, transforming the ranch into a sustainable future for all of them. What began as a battle for ownership ended as a lesson in love, understanding, and the power of family. Margaret's story is a reminder that even in the face of difficult decisions, the bonds we share with those we love are worth fighting for. And sometimes, the most important legacy we can leave isn't measured in what we own, but in how we care for each other and the memories we pass down. The ranch will continue to stand as a testament to the strength of the family, their love, and the enduring legacy they built together, no matter what challenges the future may bring.